Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to participate in this conference. My talk today is about migration in sort of the broadest sense. And in fact, my real agenda here is to talk about bird movements in general. Migration is a very familiar and stereotyped type of bird movement. Other kinds of bird movements are dispersal and vagrancy. And these three things are things I've studied for actually most of my life in one way or another. And I think that they offer insights into each other. And my point today is going to be to describe a little bit about the diversity of our avifauna here on Long Island, but also to talk about how the efforts of amateur naturalists can give us really unique kinds of information and insights into the composition of our avifauna. And I'm going to begin by talking about the traditional way of looking at biological diversity and its conservation. I assume that almost everybody here at this conference would consider themselves to be a conservationist interested in protecting biodiversity. And these three truisms are that we need good, accurate data about what organisms occur where in order to plan for their conservation and protection. Another idea that you'll find pretty prevalent is that for birds, relative to other taxa, that our knowledge is relatively complete. So we don't discover brand new species of birds very often, or vertebrates for that matter, though Jeremy is going to tell us that there are exceptions to that as well, and it's actually a good connection to this citizen science angle. And finally, that Long Island has been studied by talented naturalists for for centuries, actually. So that if there were one place in the United States besides Concord, Massachusetts, that can claim to have its biodiversity absolutely pinned down, you'd think that it was Long Island. All of these things are true, but in a qualified sense. And I would like to say that they should not be accepted uncritically, and in particular, they shouldn't be used as excuses to not do things that we have reason to know we should know better that we would like to do for other reasons. Deficiencies in data are sometimes used as excuses not to do something that we have reason to believe we ought to do. And finally, secondly, avian distribution is not as well known as people might think. And finally, even in our own backyard, there are systematic gaps, not just random imperfections, but there are actually systematic weaknesses in our knowledge of what species occur, even right here in the New York metro area. So my scheme for going through this is to look at migration, movements of birds through our corner of the world, taking a seasonal approach. I'm going to start out with fall, osprey migrating along the beach, feeding as it goes, then winter, snowy owl, spring, Blackburnian warbler, bird that neither breeds nor winters on Long Island, but which passes through in migration. And then summer, not typically a time when we think of migration, but birds are migrating vast distances to visit us, in this case Wilson's storm petrels that breed in the Antarctic and come and visit us during our summer. So this is a photograph of the way Fire Island used to look from the lighthouse. But even the way it looks now, it's still absolutely the crossroads of migration. It is a place where you can go, and I say this in a serious way, I expect to see, with very few exceptions, eventually every single species of North American bird and some non-North American birds, if I go birding there enough over my lifetime. It is a place that if birds get up and start moving, they will wind up there. So beginning with the fall, our geography really does favor encountering birds as they move around. So palm warbler. When birds are migrating south during the fall, they often do this after high pressure builds up after a cold front. Northwesterly winds are the prevailing winds under those conditions. They like that northerly component to the wind, but because the coastline takes a turn here, the westerly component of the wind actually forces them out towards the open water. They don't like to do that, so they track along the barrier beach until they make it back to the continent, concentrating sometimes just phenomenal numbers and diversity of species. Tree swallows are a common fall migrant. Ospreys, as I mentioned before. Ospreys are a little bit of a special conservation story here, because this is a bird that we figured out, not without difficulty, what was harming them, and we fixed it. And that's a case of a real success story for conventional wildlife biology in conservation. Fall migration, though, has lots of mysteries to it. Does anybody know what this bird is? It's actually not a totally familiar bird to most New Yorkers. It's a stilt sandpiper. Stilt sandpipers migrate through the middle of the continent in large numbers, but in New York State, the best place to find them is near the coast, but not on saltwater, on freshwater, grassy wetlands near the immediate coast, a bizarre combination of features that if you didn't really study it and know where to look, you could go birding for decades and decades and not get to know this bird. Another bird migrates in the fall, mainly through the center of the continent, but every year a few individuals show up along our coast. Again, not usually on the outermost coast, but in grassy habitats. It's the buff-breasted sandpiper. Almost all the buff-breasted sandpipers we get here on Long Island have one thing in common, which is a little bit unusual. They're almost all juveniles. The adults don't bother wandering out this far. And sometimes there are surprises. There are birds that fly under the radar and change their status a little bit. This is a yellow-throated warbler. It's still an uncommon to rare species, but it has become more regular in recent years. And the close attention that avid bird watchers pay to rare species has told us almost everything we know about the increasing status of this species in our region. It's not picked up in conventional wildlife monitoring effort. And there are other kinds of bird data that are very difficult to detect by traditional methods of applying constant effort or systematic effort. These are pine siskins. They're making one of their largest incursions into, this is a small finch that breeds up in the northern woodlands and occasionally erupts to the south. For combinations of food scarcity, local abundance, local resource scarcity, they move out. And this year, on one day, the 21st of October, out at Fire Island, we counted these guys, and we came up with over 20,000 pine siskins flying by the western end of Fire Island. Now, any wildlife manager who is trying to come up with a conservation plan for pine siskin, they would look at, conifer habitats in the north. They might look at places where they wind up in the suburban mid-Atlantic during invasions. But these birds were only there for a few hours of one day, and there are other birds that pass through on other days during the fall. But this concentration of individuals is biologically significant, and it's the kind of information that amateur naturalists are, in some ways, the only people who are in a position to detect and to put into a framework of past knowledge. So, for instance, if somebody were to do a environmental impact study prior to a wind turbine proposal, they might go out and sample on a series of days for what sorts of birds might be impacted by such a proposal. They wouldn't encounter that day. That day has only happened once, in my life. The chances of them encountering it would be very, very low. Indeed, it's a rare event, but it's still a biologically significant event, and it could be significant for the entire population if these 20,000 birds got subtracted out on a rare event. Moving on to winter, one of the really amazing biological phenomena that we see here on Long Island are our wintering sea ducks, like these black scoters. And if you go all around the island, every single bit of the coastline is home to sea ducks of various kinds. These are surf scoters off of Montauk. But you really get a sense of the scale of Long Island's natural resources in playing a role in the lives of these birds. And yet they're highly variable from year to year, and there are trends over decades of which species have become more abundant, less abundant. Back in the old days, in the 40s, king eiders used to occur in flocks of up to 15 off of Montauk and were decidedly the most frequent scoter, the most numerous eider everywhere on Long Island. Common eider was a rare bird on Long Island for many, many years. Absolutely the reverse today, for reasons that we largely don't understand. Other things we don't understand, why there are white-winged crossbills this year, but you can go 15 years at a time without seeing them. Flocks of them all over the place this year. Some birds are pretty reliable. These are snow buntings, which are common on our outer beaches. They're Arctic breeders, and they use our beaches during the winter. Sometimes tracked down here by snowy owls. And the theme here is that our little corner of the world is a place where birds from all corners of the world actually do wind up coming together. This is a dovekie, an Arctic breeding seabird, that actually occurs in the tens of thousands offshore from Long Island during the winter. Difficult to detect this, but they are out there, and people have known that they're out there. Occasionally we have storms that drive them in, and this bird was probably seen by many people in this room as it dunked around in a boat basin over at Timber Point a couple of winters ago. But rest assured, there are thousands and thousands of them out there almost every winter. But nevertheless, there still are really big gaps in our knowledge. This is a common murre. And this is what was known of the occurrence of common murre, not on Long Island, but in Rhode Island. The story on Long Island is almost exactly the same. In a century of field work there were just this handful of records. If you look at these localities, all of these are coastal localities except for this one offshore. Just a handful of oiled individual common murres that had come to grief and come ashore. That's the only way it was known to have occurred in Rhode Island. And yet, part of this was surely a detection problem. Part of it is probably biological, part of it is detection, because they're difficult to identify, it's difficult to get out to their actual pelagic zone of preference. So these are the records of people, including myself, well, these are my own records, who made a determined effort to go out and find and identify and document these birds just in a 10-year span. And we have now proven very, very conclusively that these are a regular, a natural part of our avifauna, both on Long Island and Rhode Island offshore. But this was really proven by amateur birders. Another gap in our understanding of which birds occur where can come from other kinds of biases. For instance, a misunderstanding of the concept of conservatism in science. Scientists like to be conservative. They don't want to make unfounded claims of fact. But sometimes they misapply this. And there's no better example of this than in the case of species that may be occurring naturally or may be occurring as escapes from captivity. What do you do with a barnacle goose that you see? You don't know whether it got away from somebody or whether it actually came from Greenland as a natural vagrant. I would argue that it's an abuse of the principle of conservatism to exclude it from the major texts that describe biodiversity. Just even though you strongly suspect that some of them are natural vagrants, but to completely exclude them on the basis that you're not 100% certain about each individual one is actually a radical idea. And when these things show up, people do notice them. It's not as though they're overlooked. And the bird watchers notice them. This is Pat Lindsay's year list sheet from the past decade. And you see barnacle goose written in because it wasn't, the records committee was not accepting them. The wildlife biologist said, oh, they're not part of our avifauna. The first couple of them have parentheses around them. Why is that? Because you can't count them, quote unquote, because they're not vetted by the authorities. But nevertheless, fortunately, there is a record of the occurrences of these birds. And when we compare that to the record of demographic increase of the Greenland breeding population, it's unequivocal. These birds are occurring as natural migrants. They now occur every year in multiples on Long Island. There's one in Inwood Hill Park in Manhattan right now. And they've now become absolutely expected, and the amateur birders know this. It's not even a bird of great interest anymore. Yet whether it's shown up on the horizon of wildlife biologists, I don't know. That's another question. But that's what I mean by systematic gaps in our knowledge of distribution for different reasons, identification problems, for conceptual problems. Moving on to spring. really a time when we often think of migration really as such a pleasurable thing to behold. There's a scarlet tanager just back from the tropics. For many, many years, people have known that if you go out to the outer beach under the right kinds of weather conditions, that you don't just find these birds around the flowering trees in the middle of May, but you find them sitting on the grass at the end of April. These are scarlet tanagers, rose-breasted grosbeaks, indigo buntings, and some of their relatives. These are birds that got interrupted in their normal migration across the Gulf of Mexico and picked up in a weather slingshot and flung up onto our beaches. This has been going on as long as people have been out here. There are records of this going back to the 1800s. But what nobody knew during those early instances of this, or even until it finally was forced upon our attention, was that some of these species, like blue grosbeak, are not just novelties. They've actually now colonized Long Island as breeders. They were showing up on our beaches for decades, if not centuries or millennia, and not breeding here. But as the environment has changed on Long Island to become suitable to them, they have now taken advantage of the fact that as highly mobile organisms, they do encounter all kinds of different places. Now they find that they can breed in the pine barrens of Long Island, and they're doing so increasingly. Same thing with summer tanager. The first breeding record was here on Brookhaven property, and they've been present, I think, most years as breeders since then. Prothonotary warbler, another southeastern United States breeding species that's expanding its breeding range northward. And the discoveries of these new breeders have been driven by citizen scientists largely. So moving to summer, I mentioned osprey. Its success story is a beautiful one, a wonderful one. It's a quintessential Long Island breeder. Another quintessential Long Island bird is the common tern. These are birds that make vast globe-trekking migrations, but they do breed with us. A couple of very familiar species of conservation concern, least terns and piping plovers. Less familiar to most, but beautiful and globally rare, roseate tern. These are the breeding summer birds. They're basically doing their thing here during the summer. But what we found by going out and paying close attention to specific areas along the coast is that there are other species that are occurring that are neither breeding species. This is an Arctic tern. They don't breed here. They don't winter here. They winter in the Antarctic. They breed in the Arctic. But yet they occur here regularly during the summer. Immature birds. What are they doing here? I don't know exactly what they're doing here, but they are here. They're part of our avifauna. They're part of our ecological communities. They connect our ecosystems with ecosystems around the entire planet. And yet they were essentially unknown, known by 3 specimens for over a century of ornithological work on Long Island, until focused efforts and improved identification revealed that they were, in fact, much more regular. And you can see these 4 Arctic terns all look different from each other, and they look like varying plumages of common terns, but this is what you see if you go out there and study them. So this is all of time prior to 1969, how many Arctic terns were known from all of New York State. The jump from 79 to 88 is due to one person who figured out how to identify him and where to look for him, Paul Buckley. He moved up to New England, and things went back to normal. And then some of his proteges, like Steve and others, took over the reins here. And we went out, and by following Paul's model, we found them. And really a very interesting example of how a species is there and yet unknown, unless you know how to look for it. And this is a theme in general of studying bird movements. You have to be receptive to the unexpected. This is a sooty tern that was sitting along the Ocean Parkway on August 28th, 2011, during the height of Hurricane Irene. During that hurricane, due to the marvels of modern meteorology, we knew that we could actually be out there on the Ocean Parkway and not drown during that one. Seriously, you have to pay close attention to things like that. But it was a remarkable storm, and it brought an unprecedented number of tropical terns and Gulf Stream species of pelagic birds by virtue of this perfect track and perfect intensity. It was intense enough to entrain birds and yet not intense enough to be a dangerous storm. We know, of course, that Sandy was far more dangerous than that. And the memory of that, recent memory of that, leads me just to another conservation question. This is a salt marsh sparrow. Salt marsh sparrows are an endangered species, in my opinion. And the reason is not that we find that their reproductive success in this marsh is low or in that marsh is high, but this one is bad or that, or predators or this. The reason that they're endangered is sea level rise. And they live in our salt marshes, and as sea level rises, unless we plan ahead, not by doing painstaking studies of what salt marsh sparrows are doing right now in this marsh here or that marsh there, but by planning where are the salt marshes going to go when the sea level rises. That's the only question. To save an entire ecological community and all of its species, it doesn't require detailed inventory knowledge. It needs a topographic map and then political willpower to protect some upland areas for salt marshes to migrate up onto from the adjacent estuaries. But in most cases, the habitat changes that affect bird abundance are much more subtle. And so, for instance, for many, many forest breeding birds on Long Island, Peter Alden mentioned that forest breeding birds in New England or in the broader taiga belt of North America are doing great. But on Long Island, our forest breeding birds are not doing well. Our forests are fragmented and small and of perilously marginal quality for many species. And detecting when a particular population of forest breeding migrant birds dips below sustainability is very difficult to do. And this is why I say that avian distributional data are very, very difficult to interpret. If you look at a marble salamander distribution map, you can see marble salamanders are absent from the urban areas around Providence, Rhode Island, but they're found in the undeveloped areas out there. And when you see a blue dot there, you know they don't occur in populations of one. There's a breeding, sustaining population that's been there for a long time since the Pleistocene, and will stay there if you protect the habitat as well. But when you look at a whippoorwill map on Long Island, you see all these blue squares. This is the change map. The blue squares are squares where it was present as a breeder in 1980, but is absent in 2000. The gray areas, like where we are right now, are areas where they were present in 1980, are still present now. But this can be very, very misleading. I would argue that whippoorwills are virtually extirpated as a functionally breeding population on Long Island. There are places where they still come. Why is it, though, that they're here? I mean, you can go out and find them. But if you actually did go to the incredibly difficult lengths of measuring their reproductive success, you would probably find that their populations are not replacing themselves here. The habitat is attractive enough to attract dispersing individuals to give it a try, but Long Island has probably become or is becoming a sink for these species. And yet it's very difficult to actually prove that or to come up with a management plan that would actually address this issue. Another systematic difficulty in understanding why certain species are where they are, when they are. So here's a northern cardinal, a bird we utterly take for granted, but which was absent here in the lifetime of many people in this room. So this is a conservation success story, but it's a success story where the conservation planners laid out a welcome mat for northern cardinals. What we did to the landscape, suburbanization of Long Island and so on and so forth, was perfect for this bird. That's not why we did it, right? Nobody did what they did in the 1930s and 40s and 50s in order to attract northern cardinals to come here, but yet this is now an absolutely abundant, widespread characteristic bird of our area. Bird distributions change, and conservation planning has to acknowledge that. It cannot take a static view that we're going to protect and preserve the given composition of species that are present at this moment and freeze that and project it into the future. The future is going to have different species, for better or worse, and probably both. These are data from the Christmas bird count showing the center of gravity of north-south distribution of North American birds as measured by huge amounts of citizen science over half a century. And the trend of northward movement of the center of geographic distribution is unmistakable. And we see it over and over again. Carolina wrens were rare to absent in our area a century ago, and yet now they are one of the most abundant birds in some habitats. Not by virtue of anybody having anticipated it or planned for it. So these are 3 Rhode Island Christmas bird counts, but they could just as easily be Eastern Long Island Christmas bird counts, showing exponential trajectories of Carolina wrens in my lifetime. So the question I come up with here is, did we know enough to explain why we have the birds that we do have here? We didn't. I think that's clear. Nobody projected in the 1940s that these were going to be Long Island birds, classic Long Island birds then. I chose these particular examples of species where my own avocational birdwatching behavior has played a major role in actually demonstrating their regular occurrence around here. There are many others, actually, that I could point out as well that were flying under the radar until people detected them and proved their existence even recently. And one of the lessons I draw from this is that vagrancy is biologically important, and yet it's very difficult to study academically. I can tell you that from the history of my grant proposals, but it is biologically interesting. It yields insights into the connection between dispersal, migration, and range distribution change in birds. And everything that we know about vagrants, almost everything that we know about vagrants, comes from amateur naturalists, not from dedicated traditional biological research. So I'll go back to my original point, and I don't mean this in any kind of in a flippant way, because those truisms that I mentioned before are certainly true. It is very, very worthwhile to have detailed inventory data to understand what we have and what it's doing and how we should plan for it. But we can turn that statement around. Not only do we need detailed biodiversity inventory data in order to plan for conservation, it is absolutely, obviously clear that we need conservation as a prerequisite for whatever biodiversity we might want to know about in the future. So the point here is that species turnover rates are very surprisingly high. And if you look at a breeding bird survey conducted this year and compare it to one conducted in 1970 to one in 1940, the typical, common, absolutely classic resident species have changed over time, and not in a way that was anticipated, planned for, or desired for any particular reason by the people who were on watch during the times when these things happened. Lack of biological inventory data should not be used as an excuse not to protect a given area when you have external sources of evidence that show what its ecological value would be. Conservationists almost never regret protecting a site. They'll say, oh, we protected the old Grumman property. It turns out that we didn't need to in order to keep American kestrels present as breeders on Long Island. But you know what? By protecting it, you will have a whole suite of species in 50 years that will be using that intact functioning ecosystem that would not be there had the place been destroyed. And that really leaves me with my finishing point here, which is the best sites over time, naturalists know where they are. And they don't change that much over time as long as they're not destroyed. They do change. What changes in these sites? The species composition, the actual identities of the species that are present there. And yet, if they are protected and maintain ecosystem function and integrity, some species will blip out, some species will move in, and yet those communities will still retain ecological value into the future. So, we think about this as we think about species that we take for granted today that are at the southern ends of their breeding ranges. It's not just birds that are moving up out of the south. Can anybody think of a bird that is near where Long Island is about the warmest place in its global range? Classic bird I like to think of is black-capped chickadee, okay? If you project what the temperature of Long Island is going to be in 50 years or 100 years, it is warmer than any place where black-capped chickadees live right now. So they probably are not going to persist on Long Island far into the future. Now, to tell a wildlife manager that you have to worry about black-capped chickadee as an endangered species, they would laugh at you if you said that, because it's one of our commonest, most ecologically tolerant species. They're found in all different habitats. And yet, there it is. It's very, very likely that in the future, that bird will drift off. And what should replace it by virtue of looking at the climate maps and this? Carolina chickadees, but they might be blocked by an urban barrier, so we might wind up with no chickadees. But this is just an example of thinking outside of the microanalysis of demography and population trends in individual species, and looking at the bigger picture of how groups of species interact and occur in our corner of the world. So this is our national symbol, a bald eagle that was hanging out at Democrat Point feeding on bait fish, handouts from the fishermen for a while. It turned out that this bird had been shot, but was brought into rehab and did survive. But it's a little vignette that I'll close with as a symbol of our biodiversity and all of its surprising and unexpected dimensions. But thank you.
10 minutes for questions, so you can keep them going for 10 minutes.
You mentioned, good show, you mentioned the whippoorwill, and there's one factor in the decline of the whippoorwill, which is a night jar, says whippoorwill, migrants or whatever. Remember about 20, 30 years ago, some of you may remember walking through an oak forest, you could hear all the poop of the gypsy moth caterpillars falling on dead leaves as you look up the skeletonized leaves. They found a parasitic fly would lay its eggs in the gypsy moth caterpillars, brought that in, and really wiped out the gypsy moths, and we couldn't even find one on our biodiversity day in any form a few years ago up in Concord. And it turns out that that little parasitic fly looked at a lot of the Saturnid moths, which are our big Io moth, Polyphemus moths, and a whole bunch of those others. It would lay its eggs in those caterpillars. And they've now found, I think, like 50 species of the big moths, and that's exactly what the whippoorwill fed on. And those big moths are disappearing. And so we solved one problem, the gypsy moth, as we created a whole bunch of new problems.
No.
That make it a major factor.
No, it's a great illustration of the unintended consequences, unanticipated consequences. And it reminds me of another closely related species to the whippoorwill is the chuck-will's widow. This is a bird that is a conservation enigma because its global breeding range is expanding northward as climate changes or for various reasons. So it's got a positive trend at the northern end of its range. And yet I would say that if you studied details of the demography of individual populations, that their prospects are diminishing into the future for the same reasons that whippoorwills are facing increasing challenges in the future. So what do we think of for our chuck-will's widows on Long Island and southern New England? Are they an increasing species that will continue to increase into the future? Will they get a toehold and then fall back? We don't know what the answers to those things are, but it's not as simple as just a single dimension to the trajectory of even one well-studied species.
I'm studying the different conservation systems and residents at Far Rockaway. But as a beach conservationist and someone who's walked and studied beaches for years and years, do you have any thoughts, do you think some pictures we've all seen as to what the ocean has done to those very beaches and what we as a society should posit in the future in terms of rebuilding, finding housing for the people that live there, where should they live, what should we as a society and as conservationists, what direction should we
Well, that's a huge question, and obviously one with a lot of non-biological aspects to it. But if the sea level is rising and the ocean pushes the dune from here to here, my first feeling would be to let the dune be where it wants to be, if at all possible. Now, obviously, it's not always going to be possible to do that, but you raise a great point when you talk about the barrier beaches, the Rockaways, and out further from that. People can talk about investing billions in building protective barriers for some area, like they built one in Providence, Rhode Island after the 1938 hurricane that killed many people there. That was a very expensive project up at the top of Narragansett Bay. You could do that at lower New York Bay, I suppose. It would be vastly bigger and more expensive, but you cannot build a barrier to protect the barrier beach. You cannot protect the Rockaways, Jones Strip, Fire Island, and so on. That is what you've got. That's where the sediments want to reside, and building on barrier beaches obviously is a perilous thing to do.
If I could go a little off topic here with a room full of bird people, do we know anything concrete about the impact of West Nile virus on bird diversity composition in North America? I mean, this is a major biological event. If you want to talk about invasive species,
Absolutely.
Do we have data?
We do. We do, and it's another example. I almost put this example into the talk, but I didn't want to make it too long. The species that we all know have been proven to be vulnerable are often in the corvid family, the crow family. American crows are extremely susceptible. They have a very high lethality rate when they are infected with West Nile virus. American crows used to occur in several different winter roosts on Long Island on the order of tens of thousands of birds, 10 to 20,000 birds. In Brooklyn, in western Suffolk County, and eastern Suffolk County, and I don't know the locations of all of them, but they're actually documented, the locations of these. Nobody has seen a winter roost of American crows in excess of 10,000 since the real first wave of West Nile virus. That species has experienced a population decrease of probably 2 or 3 orders of magnitude on Long Island since then. Still a common bird. It's not a bird of conservation concern, quote unquote, and so on and so forth. But there are ecological consequences to this. American crows now share Long Island with 2 other species in their genus, one of which is the fish crow, which is known from lab studies to be less vulnerable to the lethal effects of West Nile virus. Like instead of 99% of them dying when they're infected, I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but something like 50% of them survive an infection with West Nile virus. And their populations have demonstrably increased over the exact time period when the American crow populations went into the tank. But then there's the mystery of the third corvid species, which I know some of the folks from Queens and the common raven, which when I was a kid was considered to be a wilderness specialist. This was a bird that you could try to hope to see if you went up to the White Mountains of New Hampshire or up into the Adirondack wilderness, and was thought to be just intolerant of people. It turns out that what they were intolerant of was being shot, and once that happened less often than it used to happen, they increased around those little refugia in which they had retreated to. But it now turns out that possibly another reason that they didn't occupy the coastal lowlands was the incredibly high population density of American crows, because since the decimation of the American crow, they have invaded the coastal lowlands, and they now are breeding on Long Island in several places. And other birds that share the same ecological guild with these birds, turkey vulture and bald eagle, for instance, have also increased markedly over that very same, and black vulture, have moved into the coastal lowlands where they were previously largely absent over that same time period. These are descriptive correlations. We don't know that it's caused by the removal of the American crows, but the raw data to test that hypothesis, again, were collected by citizen scientists and bird watchers. So that's a great example of how just an accidental thing, this introduction of a foreign pathogen, can have cascading consequences for multiple vertebrate species, for instance.
One more quick question. When you're talking about the salt marsh skippers, don't you going to cite cataclysmic event that decimated their population years ago when made 2/3 of the population's Nelson sparrows?
Yeah, well, you know, that very theme actually does tie in here. One of the birds I didn't really have time to talk about in detail was the little cackling goose I showed up on the screen at one point. Steve's referring to that the old sharp-tailed sparrow was split into two species that come together in southern Maine in the marshes there. North of there, they're Nelson sparrows. South of there, they're salt marsh sparrows. And that's a technical taxonomic decision that affects the various population parameters of these birds. But a similar one was the splitting of the cackling goose from the familiar Canada goose. And the fact that we barely knew that cackling geese occurred on Long Island, in New York State, in the Northeast at all prior to that split is another example of systematic gaps in our biodiversity inventory knowledge. As soon as it became quote unquote countable for the bird watchers, whenever that was in the early 2000s, birders figured out how to identify them, went out, documented them, found them regularly around us, and we'll never know, really, to what extent the current prevalence of cackling geese in our region is a biological trend from former scarcity to present abundance, or a detection error that when they were classified as a subspecies, they were neglected by everybody, just for purely arbitrary taxonomic reasons. Thank you very much.